Morning, everyone. Um, as you might have guessed from the song, today's sermon is on having a childlike, but not a childish faith. And in my last sermon, you might recall that I spoke about leaning on Jesus in tough times and standing in the faith during our trials. And a big part of that persevering through trials comes down to where we place our faith. And today I'll be talking about what it means when we talk about having a childlike faith. And to begin with, on a lighter note, I'll focus on an example of how children are different to adults in their thinking and reasoning. And consider the following joke or riddle, if you like. And it's one which young children actually answer more correctly than adults do. And the riddle of the joke is, how do you put an elephant in the fridge? And some of you might have already heard the answer, but yeah, how do you put an elephant in the fridge? You open the fridge door, put the elephant in, and close the door. That's child reasoning. Okay. And the second follow-up question is, how do you put a giraffe in the fridge? Which I think somebody already knows. But how do you put the giraffe in the fridge? You open the fridge door, take the giraffe out, put the elephant in, and then close the door. And it's interesting that little kids know the joke, they know the riddle, but a lot of adults don't. Because when you become an adult, you lose that ability to think in such a straightforward manner. In the first scenario, it's that straightforward thinking. And in the second, it's the ability to recall such an irrelevant fact, or resort to sort of like inconsistent or illogical thinking. And what the jokes demonstrate is that children think and reason things very much differently than adults do. And when you hear those jokes or see kids play, often we laugh at what they say and do and the way they play. But then you think of all the time, all the effort, all the money we put into progressing in the adult world, growing up, knowing better, and putting the ways of our childhood behind us. And at some point, you lose the ability to see a cardboard box as a spaceship. You lose the ability to turn invisible when you put a towel or a blanket over your head. And that's how children are different. So when you think about the rush to grow up, our childhood years go by in a flash. And we all say, when you look back on your life, those are the best years of your life. I don't know how many times I heard that as a kid growing up. You don't realize it now, but the school years and the uni years are the best years in your life. You're like, yeah, right, I've got all these assignments. But you don't realize it at the time. And you think about the rush to grow up. At 16, you can learn how to drive. At 17, you can go to war. At 18, you can vote, you can get married, you can enter your own contracts, you can buy alcohol, make your own healthcare decisions. And I remember my dad told me when I turned 18, now you're old enough to pay board as well. Or in his words, yes, I actually remember that conversation. He said, you're big enough, old enough, and ugly enough to start paying your own way. And so it's sort of like a way of saying, well, now you're your own man. Okay, you're old enough. And as we mature in our thinking and decision-making, what happens? You get entrusted with more and more rights and responsibilities. And so that brings us to the sermon reading from this morning and Jesus and his disciples. And that they obviously talk about being the greatest in heaven. And Jesus puts a small child amongst them and he says, you need to change and be like this small child to enter the kingdom of heaven. And the greatest in heaven will have that lowly position of a child. So if growing up and being mature is what we all aspire to do, why does Jesus and the Bible record a story where he says we can't enter the kingdom of heaven unless we change and become like small children and have that childlike faith? That's where that saying comes from, to have a childlike faith. And I suppose the starting point here is, why are children said to have a lowly status? And the reason for that is because children are very much dependent in nature, which in turn makes them humble. So children depend on their parents basically to provide for all their needs, everything. And as a child, you're subject to your parents' decision making. You're subject to your parents' rules, their regulations. And apart from that, they're also small in body and stature. That their brains aren't fully developed, and they don't have authority over anything or anyone really. When we talk about lowly status, that's what we mean. Children are dependent on other people's decisions, other people providing for them, and their bodies and minds aren't fully developed either. Having said that, though, anyone with small children will know when your child keeps asking you why, right? Well, why is that so? Well, why did you make that decision? Why do we have to eat this tonight? Why? And as an example of their lowly status, sometimes the parent can just say, why? Because I said so. What can the child do? Nothing, because I said so. And so what it means is the parent is not answerable to the child. But we don't necessarily need to tell them an explanation. So that's what we mean about a child having a lowly status. And so when we speak of a child's humility, that lowly status and humbleness, it stems from knowing that their life and all their needs are fulfilled by their parents and caregivers. And what Jesus is telling the apostles is that entering the kingdom of heaven can't be gained through any personal accomplishment or anything that you do, or trying to be better than everyone else, trying to be the greatest. Man, that's not what gets you into heaven. So to enter heaven, you have to humble yourself to the point of being like a little child and realizing that you have to depend on God, our sovereign God who provides for all our needs, for all our life. And we are indeed wholly reliant on his grace and mercy towards us, just as an infant relies on their parents. And as an example of that, why does reliance result in a lowly status or being humble or having humility? So imagine you're bedridden, you can't get out of bed, you can't look after yourself financially or physically. You'd be dependent on someone to care for you. And in that knowledge, you wouldn't be arrogant or proud or be belligerent towards that person looking after you. You are forced to be humble, because if you upset that carer, what can the carer do? They walk away and nobody's looking after you. So being dependent means you are by nature, have to show humility. And yeah, just as the graphic shows here as well, humility is not about thinking about yourself lowly, okay? Because the words humbleness means you're not thinking about yourself at all. Okay, humility is not thinking about yourself lowly. It's about thinking of God in the highest possible esteem and his greatness. And when you think about God and his status and his nature, it sort of makes you realize that you're humble, just as the way someone who's bedridden is humbled when they think about their carer. So knowing that God operates and exists on a level unimaginably higher than us, it not only humbles us, but it means we also can't always fathom the way in which God works in our lives. And that's why we often say God works in mysterious ways. And in Isaiah 55, 8-9, that's where it says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. So there's many things which God has done or will do, which we'll never fully understand. We may question God, we may challenge God, but that's the exact opposite of demonstrating humility. If you question something or challenge something, you're not showing humility or humbleness, and you're not dependent on that which you are questioning or challenging. And the obvious example here is Job. Job had his suffering and he questioned God. Why, God? What have I done wrong? But God didn't give him a direct answer. He showed him the wonders of the world and creation. And he asked Job the question, and what do you really know? So God didn't answer Job directly because he owed Job no explanation. He is God, and it happened because he said so. Another example is the book of Jonah. And of course, Jonah, probably the worst prophet of all time, but he tries to run away from God, and then he gets upset with God. And God basically, the end of Jonah is basically God saying to Jonah, do you have any right to be upset with me? Okay. We are human, he is God. But that's the difference between man and his creator. And, just as a parent can tell a child, because I said so, that's effectively what God told Jonah, what God told Job, because I said so. But God doesn't know us an explanation. But that's what it means to be dependent. Okay? When you depend on something, you're very loath or reticent to criticize or condemn it. So I've got 3 passages here from Luke and James, all emphasizing that by demonstrating humility and putting others first, that's what humility basically is defined as, when you put the needs of others before your own. When you do that, God will exalt you, lift you up, and show favor to the humble. So knowing God and all he's done for us should bring us an attitude of humility. When someone does something very grand and extravagant for you, you're humbled. You did all that for me? Okay. And so that's another sense of humility. But how often does our inner Job or our inner Jonah come out? In order to be humble and wholly reliant on God, that means you can't be wholly reliant on yourself. If you put yourself first and foremost and you try to be the greatest, but by definition, you can't also be wholly reliant on God. Okay. So these passages in Psalms and Matthew tell us that God guides the humble, and God is to be our only instructor, our servant leader, because God came to serve and not be served. And that humility and humbleness to follow and rely on God is critical when trials and challenges come our way in life. A story I shared in my last sermon concerned a difficult season I was going through. And to just quickly recap, I had all these plans. I had a great deal of faith in them, and with good reason, and I set up the dominoes and I was just waiting for them to fall, but they never did. So naturally, when you make plans, you rely on your education, you rely on your intellect, you rely on your connections, you rely on your work experience, you rely on your life experience. So I put all that into the plan. I kept banging my head against that wall. Why isn't this domino just falling? Why, God? Until it became evident that maybe that's not what I was called to do. And when you start asking why, God, you're getting into Job's territory. You're literally questioning God. Why? And so when you start doing that, you think, well, where is my faith actually placed? Is it in what I know and what I've achieved, or is it in God? Now, I still don't know why those plans never came to fruition, but God does. I changed my plans, my prayers, but funnily enough, the most unlikely of doors began to open. Like the most outlandish plan Z came to fruition, and doors continue to be opened. And how and why is this happening? I don't know. It's not me. You wouldn't write a story like that. It's God. God is great. God is good. And you humble yourself before God, and he will exalt you, show you favor, and lift you up. And it wasn't until I sort of like let go and let God take control. Okay, but that's an example of humility. And I came across this saying which I thought was quite good, which summarizes that point. A humble man is not afraid of failure. In fact, he is not afraid of anything, even himself, since perfect humility implies perfect confidence in the power of God. It's a bit of a word salad, but when you think about the humble person who shows pure humility and a pure confidence and reliance in God's nature, what that means is you got full confidence that God has got your back. God is your wingman. And as you move, well, and if God's got your back, but what are you afraid of? Right? You're not afraid of anything anymore. And as you move closer and closer towards that perfect humility, you get more and more certainty. You become less and less afraid. And that's what helps get you through those trials and hardships in life. Because at some point in life, you'll have enough troubles where you can't rely on your own intellect, skill, education, connections to dig your way out of it. Okay, you have to rely on something bigger and stronger to get yourself through. So that was about humility. That's the main point from the sermon reading, a child's humility, but being the core of that childlike faith. But when you think about perfect humility equals perfect confidence in God's power, that's a form of trust. So how does a small child demonstrate trust? And the example there is, I can remember my youngest 4.5-year-old, he can fall asleep in any situation. You know, there could be an earthquake, he'd still fall asleep. And one night recently, we're on the tram coming back pretty late at night, and he fell asleep. And yeah, I had to carry him back quite a way home. But he didn't wake up. He didn't have any concerns because he knew mummy and daddy would get him home safely. Whereas I compared that to when I did a lot of traveling solo around the world. You can't sleep, you can't rest. You're always very vigilant. I've got everything in my bag, and if I fall asleep, anyone can just take whatever they want. Okay, so there's a difference there. Okay. And the other example is when young children try something new on the playground for the first time. They always want their mummy or daddy next to them to hold their hand or be ready to catch them should they fall. And it's that same sort of trust which children have in their parents to provide for all their needs. So there's a passage here in Luke 18:15 through 17, which mirrors that sermon reading in Matthew 18:1 through 5. But interestingly, when you look at this passage, Luke 18:15 through 17, you look at the stories that come before it and come after it. What sandwiches this story about the little children coming to Jesus? So the story before this concerns divorce, but very much an adult problem. The story that follows this concerns the rich man who couldn't part ways with his treasure. Now, they're very much grown-up problems. And when you think of a child, what relationship problems do they really have? It's never the child's fault. If there's a relationship problem, it's because there's a bad parent. And when you think of the riches, what does a child care for possessions or money? One way to find out, give a little kid $100 and see what they do with it. They'll probably give it to their friend. Okay. So yeah, it's an example of trust and what children have, that unwavering faith. That's what allows little children to jump off rocks and know that someone's there to catch them. And if you think about what trust is and being humble, if you're humble enough to put your trust in something or someone else, it means you're placing your safety and well-being in someone else's hands. A child trusts his or her parents, just as we should place our faith in God and his word to guide us, protect us, and enter into his kingdom. And there's some verses there from Psalms and Nahum. And God will never let you fall when you place your trust in him. And I like that cartoony graphic up there. When you learn to trust God like a child, falling becomes fun because you know someone's there to catch you. You're not. It's not the fall that gets you. It's the sudden ending, right? But if you know someone's there to catch you, it's a lot different. The other point that's linked to a child's humility is that of awe and wonder. So part of the reason we put all of our trust in God and his wisdom is because when we encounter that which deserves all of our attention and devotion, you can't help but be in awe, wonder, and amazement. So the three sayings here from Proverbs. Proverbs is one of my favorite books, the books of wisdom. And the three passages here all refer to a form of humility and fearing the Lord. Now, when we talk about fearing the Lord, it doesn't mean that we should be terrified of God or dread God, but the better description is rather to be in awe, in wonder, or in amazement or reverence of God's overwhelming nature. And how does that relate to children? That sense of awe and wonder. But when you think about it, children actually have that capacity a lot more than adults do. When you think of a small baby, that they have wonder weeks. So in the first few weeks of their life, that they'll realize things like, oh, wow, that's my hand. And you can progress their achievements through these wonder weeks. Small toddlers, for a very small moment of time, they look up to their daddy like a superhero because he's so big, so strong, so smart. He can protect everyone from all the dangers in the world. And as kids get a bit older, we ask them, what do you want to be when you grow up? Okay. Because the world is their oyster. They can dream. They can do whatever they want. I think at the moment, Cody wants to be some sort of scientist or chemist because he wants to invent a indestructible sort of steel or something, right? But that's where invention comes from. Okay. And just when you think about that, what did you want to be when you were young? And what happened to that dream? That sense of dreaming, awe and wonder sort of comes to a sudden stop at some point. Like a public servant for a long time. But what little kid grows up saying, I want to be a public servant? Not many. But the point here is children still believe in fairy tales, miracles, chasing their dreams, and thinking of the world in terms of fantasies. And I don't know too many adults who could make that same face. If you look at that boy up there, he's just met Bluey. You can just tell by looking at him, he's in awe, wonderment. It's the most amazing thing he's ever seen. And I just wonder, when's the last time as an adult you have that same sense of wonderment and awe? And as an example about wonderment and awe, I think of my son Caden. He's 4.5, and he's just getting out of this stage now. But he used to always wave at trams and trains and things like that. And because we used to live in the city, he'd wave at the tram drivers, and some tram drivers would smile, some would wave back, some would give a thumbs up, some would do a little fancy tune on the bell, ding, 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 ding. Some would even talk to him over the loudspeakers, the external speakers. Thank you very much, little boy. Travel safe. He got a real kick out of it. Okay, you could see the enjoyment on his face. But what he didn't understand is when there was a tram driver who just didn't respond at all. It's like I'm waving at them, I'm saying hello, they're just ignoring me. What's going on? And then he says, why was there no reaction? What's going on? Now, that's a child's thinking, but as an adult, how many times are you going to wave at someone, or a stranger, and just expect a response, a favorable response? We wouldn't dream or dare embark on such an interaction. And, it's that sense of awe and wonderment, that curiosity that children have, which actually makes them learn more about the reality and truth of the world. Okay, that's what helps them grow up and learn about the society which surrounds them. So as adults, we try not to lose that sense of awe and wonderment when it comes to our relationship with God, because that too will shape our understanding concerning the truth of the world and our role in it. Because when you think, what does it mean to be in awe of something? It means it's greater than yourself, much greater than yourself. So you become humble and show humility towards it. You become subservient towards it. And when you're confronted with God's nature, you are confronted with the overwhelming nature of God, and you try to live a life that's pleasing and in obedience to God's will. And being in awe of God's nature is to know that He will hold all people accountable for their actions in a perfectly just manner. And then the passage here from Psalms, it compares the Father's compassion for His children, just as the Lord has compassion on those who fear Him, who are in awe of Him. For He knows how we're formed, and He remembers that we're just dust. What are we to God? We're just dust. Okay? The life of mortals is like grass. We flourish for a season, and then we're gone. But the amazing thing is that from everlasting to everlasting eternity, God's love is with those who are in awe of Him. He loves us so much, even though we're really, in substance, nothing. We are subservient to Him in every possible way. But still, God lavishes us with goodness and love, and gives us the hope of being reconciled to Him. So that gets me to the point of being childlike versus childish. So it's with that sense of awe and wonderment that kids still dream and play. It's how they learn and grow and develop into adults. However, if you think about what are dreams and goals without work? If you have a dream and don't work towards it, it's just an idle fantasy. Okay. And if you dream of being an Olympian, but you never train or you never practice, it's a meaningless fantasy, isn't it? But without work, that dream's never going to become a reality. And the point here is you can't live in your own fantasy world forever. And I think, Jordan Peterson made a comment similar, like there are a few things more repulsive than an adult infant, an infantile adult, or like an adult who refuses to grow up. Okay, if you think about what children learn in the first few years of life, they learn how to walk, talk, read, write, amongst many other major things they achieve in life. Now, as an adult, if you told me, Wayne, you're going to have to learn how to walk, talk, read, write, do all that stuff again from scratch, I don't know if I could cope. And that's the sort of work that kids put in. But there is a big difference between childish and being childlike. And a lot of people get these two terms confused. When we refer to childlike, it emphasizes the positive aspects of being a child, their innocence, their trust, their humility. When you say someone is childish, it's about the negative aspects of being a child, their temper tantrums, when they're pouting, when they lack patience. Okay, so an example here is my kids are at that age where they love to play superheroes. Okay, they pretend they got superpowers. I may be playing a child's game in a childlike manner, pretending that they do actually have superpowers. Oh no, I'm frozen. Okay, but it's only the child acting childish because they actually believe that they do have superpowers. And another example is when wives say that their husbands are just big kids. Okay, hopefully most of us men can now confidently respond that we're acting childlike and not childish. And a lot of you may already be thinking of Paul's epistles and letters to the Corinthians, and also some passages in Hebrews that warn us against being childish in nature. So in 1 Corinthians 13:11, it reads, "When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me." And in 1 Corinthians 3:1-3, it says, brothers and sisters, actually, I'll just summarize the next 2 points, but in 1 Corinthians and Hebrews there, the third and fourth dot points, it's basically reminding them that they're not ready for solid food. In Christ, they still have milk. You're only ready to consume milk, not solid food. And what linked that childishness? That childishness was linked to their worldliness. That the more you're in the world, the less childlike you are, the less humble, the less humility you have. And not being familiar with the teachings about righteousness. So how do we reconcile Christ's words to be like children, to enter the kingdom of heaven, with Paul's notes, which say to put away childish things? And there, you have to think about context. So when we think about the Corinthian church, normally we read passages before the Lord's Supper because they were very immature in their faith. And that letter from Paul, that quote is when they're talking about their gifts, okay, and the immature approach they had to interpreting, their gifts and what it meant. And so the way for Paul to correct the Corinthian church was basically to say, grow up and be more mature in your faith. In your thinking, you're not to be like children. You grow up in your understanding of God and his word and its application. Whereas Jesus' reference to being like children, like we just discussed, is primarily in respect to their humility. Okay, because in context, what were the disciples talking about? Who's the greatest? I'm the greatest, I'm going to be. He's talking about humility and being humble, and the traits associated with it, which we just spoke about, like awe and trust. And what this serves as a warning is against those people who don't want to think about their faith or take things too seriously. And I've heard people say, oh, I just want a simple faith, okay, a childlike faith. But to actually say that is actually quite childish and not very virtuous, because just like having a dream to be an Olympian with no work, you don't want to be fed milk forever. Okay, spiritual growth also requires goals and work. So to live on milk alone shouldn't be an aspirational goal, but a transient period on the way to greater discernment and understanding. And even Paul acknowledges the positive traits of children in 1 Corinthians 14:20. He says, brothers and sisters, stop thinking like children. In regard to evil, be infants, but in your thinking, be adults. So what does that mean? So God gave us free will and intelligence for a reason, to discover the truth and learn more about him. And the devil wants nothing more for people to stop reading and learning about the word. Because when you have an idle mind, it's often said that an idle mind is like the devil's playground or the devil's workshop, because it's ripe for sowing improper thoughts. However, when it comes to sin or evil, we're meant to be childlike in respect to that sin or evil. And what does that mean? It means as we grow and mature, we gain in knowledge and understanding. But what it means here in relation to sin is that as we grow up, we shouldn't become more and more proficient in our sinful ways or our knowledge of it. But rather, in respect of sin, we should be as remote from that as a child is. Okay? Because little children don't know how to lie until they're about 3 years old. Sin is a very unnatural concept. It's a learned trait and ability. And a good example of that as being like a child towards sin is when you ask a young child, what's the naughtiest word you possibly know? I say, oh, I shouldn't say it, I shouldn't say it. Okay, just whisper it in my ear. Silly, all right? Or stupid. They think that's the worst word in the world. But what happens when we grow up and become adults? You ask that same question, what's the worst word you know? It's a different story, because what have we done? We've matured in our inequity. We've grown proficient with that sort of concept. And that's what Paul's admonishing here. As you get older, get better and more experienced with everything, but not the ways of evil and sin. Yeah, there's a quote there from Matthew Henry, but the key point is be thoroughly acquainted with the practice. Do not be thoroughly acquainted with the practice of sin, but rather to know and love deeply the word of God. And the other point I'd make here is raising your children in the truth so that they're acquainted with it and they can mature with it, and it keeps them from wandering into that idle mind or that becoming all too familiar with sinful ways. And I'll just go through a quick story at work. And so that they used to have these debates, lively debates, morning tea around the water cooler. And so two of the people who were often involved, one is now an associate professor at a top 20 university, very smart guy, but well-known atheist. Another lady was high-ranking official at a lot of the big four accounting firms, very, very smart. She was raised a Catholic, but left the faith. And so, and one was Italian, the other was Spanish. So there's lots of talking with hands and very animated, sort of lively discussion. And one day they're talking about this movie, and the whole premise of this movie is this man has a son, and he has a disease which is terminal. This disease is going to kill his son. And there's only one person with the antidote in the whole world, and it's a rich man. And the man says, "I'll do anything, just give me the antidote." He says, "It's not for sale." He said, "The only way you can get the antidote is to kill this other man, my enemy. I want him dead. You kill that man, I'll give you the antidote." And so the quandary there is, what lengths would you go to save your son's life? And so, I get roped in as the token Christian, and I start going on about the image of God. It's not for us to desecrate, God's sovereign will in our lives, the difference between taking a life and having a life taken, not confusing Christian beliefs with what a flawed Christian is. Don't look at me to see what Christianity is about. But of course, there's no convincing them. Okay. Oh, what if that were your son? Oh, that's just, another Christian, hypocrite, moral relativism, et cetera, et cetera. So the key point to that whole story is not that discussion. It's when I came home, I said, "Oh, I wonder what Cody will say. He's not going to talk for half an hour. He's just going to give me a response, in like a few seconds." So I put that same story in a more child-friendly way to Cody, and he thought about the problem, and he responded almost instantly. And he said, "Murder is wrong. It was even one of the 10 commandments, but when we die is up to God." The biblical premise and reasoning of a child still arrived at the same outcome I did. He didn't need to know the intricacies of what the secular world believes or all the arguments behind it, because he's armed with the truth, simple biblical truth. And when it comes to sin and the ways we justify it, the arguments that get put forward for it, he's still infant towards it, which is why he could answer so quickly and so confidently. Okay, that's yeah. And when you think of the song we sang before the sermon, "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so." Little ones to him belong. They are weak, okay, lowly in status, humility, lacking in authority, but he is strong. God is all the things that what we aren't, and we can rest in his strength. Yeah, and so it's just important to raise our kids in the truth. And as one final point in conclusion, when we think about a childlike faith, it's one of humility and dependence on God. It manifests itself when we think about the awesome nature of God and the trust we place in him for all of our needs, just as a child trusts their parent. And a childlike faith is not to be confused with a childish faith. Okay, so we are to walk towards spiritual growth, maturity, and discernment. However, in relation to sin, we should still try to be as infants. Okay, but we don't try to grow more proficient in our sinning. or our knowledge of it. So, and the final point is, let us remember, there's lots of kids here at Metro, and we try to remember to raise our children in the truth and, to aid their growth and maturity. And with that, I'll hand the time back to John. Thank you.